Today's scripture reading is from the book of Esther, chapter 4, verses 9 through 17. I will be reading from the New Revised Standard Version Bible. Please listen for these holy words. Hatak went and told Esther what Mordecai had said. Then Esther spoke to Hatak and gave him a message for Mordecai, saying, "All the king's servants and the people of the king's provinces know that if any man or woman goes to the king inside the inner court without being called, there is but one law. All alike are to be put to death. Only if the king holds out the golden scepter to someone, may that person live. I myself have not been called to come into the king for 30 days. When they told Mordecai what Esther had said, Mordecai told them to reply to Esther, "Do not think that in the king's palace you will escape any more than all the other Jews. For if you keep silence at such a time as this, relief and deliverance will rise for the Jews from another quarter, but you and your father's family will perish. Who knows? Perhaps you have come to the royal dignity for such a time as this." Then Esther said in reply to Mordecai, "Go gather all the Jews to be found in Susa, and hold a fast on my behalf, and neither eat nor drink for 3 days, night or day. I and my maidens will also fast as you do. After that I will go to the king, though it is against the law, and if I perish, I perish." Mordecai then went and did everything as Esther had ordered him. A holy reading for the people of God. Thanks be to God.
Thank you so much, Carter, for reading that scripture. You did a great job. So we are in, you can applaud Carter for doing a great job reading that scripture. So we are in the book of Esther this morning in our Bible year readings. At my house this week, I was talking to my family about getting the sermon together, and they said, "I did not know that there was a Hester in the Bible." I said, "Because there's not." They had not heard of the book of Esther, and I thought that this was just a story that everybody read. But I now remember that, as a young girl, I read every story about women in the Bible, and this was definitely one of my favorites. And so I read the book of Esther over and over and over as a teenager. And so as we get into the book of Esther this week, I really hope that you'll give it a read this week. Even if you're not doing the Bible year readings, I just hope that you'll pick up the book of Esther and read it this week. It's only about 10, 13 chapters. I can't remember. It's been a whole week since I've gotten into it and dove into it. But it's a pretty short book, and it is very entertaining. There is a lot that happens in the book of Esther. There's some dark stuff that happens in the book of Esther, so be warned. It's important that we read this book with diligence and that we read this book through the lens of God. Now, you may find that very interesting because in the book of Esther, God is never mentioned, not one time. You never hear the name of God. You never hear anybody pray to God. God is not mentioned in the book of Esther. And yet I invite you to read the book this week through the lens of what God is doing. So you might wonder if there's a book about women in the Bible, and then a book that does not mention God at all, why is it in our canonized scripture, especially our Old Testament scripture? It's a good question to ask. There's one very main, obvious reason when you get to the end of the book is going to be the instatement of the Jewish holiday of Purim. And Jews still today celebrate Purim. It's a huge Jewish holiday that's celebrated every year. If you haven't heard of it, that's okay. I'll go into it here in just a little bit about what they do and what the celebration is over. But this book explains why the holiday of Purim exists, why they celebrate it, and what it means. But I believe there is more reason than that of why this text is included in our canonized scripture. And that, again, means that we have to read it with very intentional eyes. We have to read it deeper than what's going on the surface. So let's dive into the story. The book of Esther is written about 100 years after the Israelites go into Babylonian exile. So at this point, we know, as we read through Ezra and Nehemiah over the past week or so, I'm not going to count how many, but a lot of the Jewish people, a lot of the Israelites went back to Jerusalem. Remember, that's what we talked about last week. So they went back and they rebuilt the temple, they rebuilt the city. But a lot of Jewish people stayed in Persia, stayed in specifically the capital city of Susa, and that's where this book takes place. And so it involves the Jewish people, the remnants of the Babylonian exile in Persia, in the capital of Susa. And so the person who is in charge at the time is King Artaxerxes. We'll call him Xerxes for short. So King Xerxes is in power, and King Xerxes, like any good king, loves to show off his riches and his greatness. And so he is always throwing these lavish banquets just to kind of feed and drink and show off all of his gold and all of his riches and bring people into the kingdom. And so we catch up in the beginning of this book at one of these two banquets. And this banquet, it says it goes on for 100-something days, 100-plus days. And so this is a massive just exploitation of his wealth. And it says on the last day of this banquet, he has shown off all of his things except for his wife and her beauty. And so he calls for Queen Vashti to come before, and at this point, this group of people has been drinking and eating for over 100 days. Okay, so you can just imagine this party. And he sends for his servants to go and get Queen Vashti and bring her so that everybody can see how beautiful she is. I'll let you imagine what that would feel like or be like. I don't think they're just witnessing her beauty, if you will. You have to, again, read beneath the text of what is going to be happening in this moment. And Queen Vashti says no. She's not coming. Not only is King Xerxes left embarrassed, but the people who are in his ear say, "You cannot let that happen. Because if the other women in the province find out that the queen has said no to the king, it's all off. Women will be going wild. We just cannot have that." And so they convince King Xerxes to write a decree, to write a law, that all women are to be subject to the masters of their house. So this goes into law that all women are to be subject to the masters of their house. And King Xerxes puts a stamp on it. So this law goes out, and of course, Queen Vashti is immediately deposed from her title. We don't really know what happens to Queen Vashti, but I can only imagine that it's not good. I don't know what her ending is, but I'm sure that it wasn't great. And we find out that King Xerxes puts out another edict, another decree for his people to find every young virgin in the land and to bring them to the kingdom so there can be a beauty pageant of sorts for the next queen. And this is where we need to be very careful with the way we read this text, because I have heard this text preached in, I believe, very incorrect and harmful ways. Most famously by a pastor named Mark Driscoll of a very large church in the United States. I don't know if you're familiar with him, but he preached a pretty famous sermon on the book of Esther that went pretty viral. And here's what he said about Queen Esther. He said that she was a promiscuous young girl who entered herself into this beauty pageant contest to become queen over Persia because she knew how good she was, if you know what I mean, and that she would definitely win the queenship. If you have your Bibles with you, it is so important for us to read this text this morning. So if you have them, or if there's one in front of you and you want to read it, we are in chapter 2 of the book of Esther. If not, listen very carefully. Chapter 2 of the book of Esther, and I am going to start in verse 8. When the king's order and his edict were proclaimed, and when many young women were gathered in the citadel of Susa in the custody of Haggai, Esther was taken into the king's palace and put in the custody of Haggai, who had the charge over the women. The young woman pleased him and won his favor, and he quickly provided her with her cosmetics treatments and a portion of food with 7 choice maids from the king's palace, and he advanced her and the maids in place of them in the harem. Esther did not reveal her people or kindred, for Mordecai had charged her not to tell. And every day Mordecai would walk back and forth in front of the court of the harem to learn how Esther was and how she fared. Let's dive into that just a little bit. Mark Driscoll compares this portion of Esther as to a woman going on the show The Bachelor. He says that she's using her beauty and her prowess to gain power in this moment. I think we need to be very careful to read the text that way. Because this text says that these women were taken into custody. They were taken into the kingdom. They were held, many of them, I believe all of them, against their will. And Esther's hiding of her identity, as you read, Mordecai told her, don't tell anybody that you're Jewish. He does not know why she is being taken. His immediate thought is hide your identity to protect yourself. The Jewish people, especially the Jewish women, this is a Jewish orphan woman. Mordecai is her uncle, not her father. This is a Jewish orphan girl. The worst thing that could happen is that she be taken into custody of the king of Persia and he find out that she is a Jewish orphan. So Mordecai says, don't tell them who you are. And so she hides her identity. That's understandable in this. I do not read this text to be that she is doing anything to cause what happens to her. She is beautiful, she does fare well, and she ends up becoming queen. This is how we get Queen Esther. Then, after she becomes queen, we find out the rest of the story and the things that happen. And they're important things, and her, like we read in our text today, her rise to power as queen could have been providential so that she could be in a place to use her voice for such a time as this. But I do think that we have to read this text very carefully in the way that that came to be. And we have to respect and honor her full story. So, after she becomes queen, we find out that Mordecai, her uncle, is at the city gates, and he overhears a plot to kill the king. And he tells the plot to Esther, and Esther tells the plot to the king, and the king goes, oh my goodness, thank you so much, Mordecai, for saving my life. This is kind of a weird little story, but it'll come back into play. So Mordecai overhears and saves the king's life. The king doesn't really do anything in response to his life being saved, but he says, thank you, Mordecai. Then we understand that there's a man named Haman who rises to power in King Xerxes' kingdom. And Haman is our villain in this story. Haman is the bad guy. And Haman, he rises to power, and in fact, he loves power so much. He commands everybody as he's riding through town to bow to him as he's riding along through town. And guess who does not bow to Haman? Mordecai. Mordecai will not bow to Haman, will not bow to this sort of overt evil power. And so Haman can't stand Mordecai and wants Mordecai to die. Doesn't just want Mordecai to die, but finds out that he is a Jew. And so he finds out that he's a Jewish person and that the Jews have their own set of laws, right? We know about this. They have their own set of laws that many times go against the king's law. And so he's like, this is perfect. I will convince the king to annihilate all of the Jews. Because you can't have a people that have laws other than the king's law. This could cause problems later on. And so he makes a plan that he's going to get the king to sign an edict for all the Jews to be killed. And he decides to roll a dice to find out which day this edict should happen. So what day the decree should go out for all the Jews to be killed. And he rolls the dice. The dice in Hebrew is called pur. So dice is called pur. And he rolls it, and it lands on the 13th of Adar. So the 13th of the last month of the year, all the Jews are to be killed. So Mordecai sends notice to Esther. This is what's happening. You've got to do something about it. Maybe you have come to power for such a time as this. Maybe this is exactly why you are queen, even though it's horrific the way she got there, right? We have to recognize that. We have to honor that. But maybe you have come to power for such a time as this. But her reaction is, if I go to the king and the king has not called me to go to him, I'm dead. Anybody who approached the king without being asked to come to the king would be killed. And she has not been called to the king for another 30 days. But she understands exactly what Mordecai is saying, and she understands that this very possibly could be the call on her life. And so she has this famous statement in this chapter 4 that we read this morning, that Carter did a great job of reading this morning. She says, I will go, and if I perish, I perish. Which again is sort of the exact understatement of what I was saying a couple weeks ago, that the call on our lives by God many times asks for us to give everything. Asks for us to be bold with our voices, bold with our purpose, bold with the power to which has been given to us. And so she goes. And she is accepted. She receives the golden scepter from the king to come and speak to her. Okay, so she gets to come in front of the king. She receives entrance to be in his presence. So you're thinking, like I'm thinking, this is where she says, please free all of my people, right? She's in front of the king. She's risked her life. She's right there. And she says, if it pleases you, would you and Haman come to a banquet that I'm preparing this evening? This doesn't make any sense. This doesn't make any sense. She invites him to a banquet. She has his ear. In fact, forgot, very important part. Not only does he say, you can come in and speak to me, but he says, Queen Esther, what do you want? I will give you anything. Up to half the kingdom is yours. Just ask for it. And this is when she responds, will you come to a banquet? Okay, so she's literally been given, you can have anything you want, and she calls for a banquet. So he shows up at the banquet. She feeds him lots of food, lots of drink. And again, the second time he says, Queen Esther, I've come to your banquet. What would you like? Up to half the kingdom, anything is yours. What do you want? And again, she has his full attention, and she says, will you come to another banquet tomorrow? Second time, she asks him to go to another banquet the next day. None of this is making sense. But then that night, again, he's had lots of food to eat, lots to drink, and that night he cannot sleep well. And so back in those days, they did not count sheep, apparently, like we do today, if you cannot sleep. What they did was they had the laws read to them, which also sounds like a very good idea to get some good sleep. So the records, a servant came in and starts to read the royal records, the royal decrees, the royal laws. And what happens is as the servant is reading through the records and King Xerxes is trying to go to sleep, they read about Mordecai saving his life. Remember that story in the very beginning? And he goes, I forgot about that. Did we ever do anything for that guy? And what he finds out and what he recognizes is like, this guy saved his life and he never really thanked him very well. So he's like, I need to do something for him. And so the next day he wakes up and he goes to the second banquet that Esther has invited him and Haman to. And this time Haman, the night before, as King Xerxes is trying to get to dreamland, Haman has another encounter with Mordecai where Mordecai is like, I'm not bowing to you. I'm not giving you any pleasure of you being the powerful one over me. And Haman is done. And I will let you read what Haman does because it is real gross. But Haman prepares something for Mordecai. We'll put it that way. And so he is going to go to the king the next day and have more, like, we're moving up the date. I can't wait to the 13th of Adar for this guy Mordecai. He's got to go. Okay, so he's ready to get to the banquet, and he's ready to say, Mordecai's got to go. And King Xerxes is coming to the banquet going, we got to do something great for that Mordecai guy. So they're coming to the banquet with different versions of what's about to go down this day. But the first thing that happens is King Xerxes says, Queen Esther, thank you so much for this beautiful banquet. What would you like? Up to half the kingdom is yours. Anything you would like. The third time she is asked. And this time, she does not ask them to a third banquet. On this third request, she says, there is somebody who has written a decree, an edict, for me as a Jewish woman and for all of my people, the Jews, to be killed on the 13th of Adar. Can you save us? The king is like, huh? What? Who could do this to my queen and all these people? Surely this isn't true. And he was like, who could this be? And she goes, Haman. I mean, this really is Hollywood stuff. You've got to read this book. And she goes, it's Haman. And he goes, what? How could you? And Haman's like, no, you don't understand. Mordecai's a horrible guy. You've got to do something. And he goes, no. Mordecai's not the bad guy. He saved my life. Remember? And so the whole story flips, and what Haman had prepared for Mordecai, which is really gross, you really need to go read it, ends up being flipped upon him. And so Haman is deposed, we'll put it that way. Haman is deposed, but there's still this decree, because the king can't just write off his own law. If he makes something into law, he has to stick by it. So Mordecai is raised to power in Haman's spot, and Mordecai has the king's signet ring, and so he does a kind of like a double decree. So on the 13th of Adar, he puts into law that the Jews are able to defend themselves against anybody who would come after them. And so the 13th of Adar comes, and it's pretty gruesome, but the Jewish people do stand up for themselves and annihilate their enemies. And then the 14th and 15th, the next 2 days, they rest and celebrate their deliverance. And now we still celebrate the 14th and 15th of Adar, this holiday, as Purim, this Jewish holiday. And what's so interesting is, has anybody in here ever celebrated Purim with their Jewish friends? Okay, not very many. Okay, if you ever get invited to a Purim party, go. It's very, very fun. It's kind of like a mix between Halloween and Mardi Gras. Okay, so everybody gets together. It's a huge party with lots of food, lots of drinking, just like these banquets, but everybody wears costumes. Everybody wears a mask or a mustache or something to disguise themselves. Why might they celebrate Purim in that way? Well, it goes back to this story of Esther, where if we just read on the surface, we hear a very interesting, weird story. But if we go deeper, we see that God has been at work the whole time, even though God is never mentioned. And that God is at work, sometimes disguised as people we would never, ever suspect God to be at work within. That's not to say that Esther and Mordecai are great examples of morality. It's not to say that Esther and Mordecai and King Xerxes are great examples of what we think of as godliness. But what it does say is that God is always, always at work, even when we can't see it. And so many times, God is at work in reversals. So remember when we talked about at the very beginning of this book, the one place we would think to never look for power, because what is the very first decree made at the beginning of the book of Esther? That women are to be subjects to the masters of their homes. So we are told in the very first page, the women in this book have no power. And yet, it is the women in this book who hold all of the power to change what happens. If Queen Vashti wouldn't have said no, there would be no Queen Esther. And so her standing up for herself and her own dignity creates opportunity and space. And we have to honor that, because I don't know what happens to her. But we have to honor her voice in saying no. And then when we see Queen Esther and we recognize she uses her place, she uses the power within her that she's not even quite sure she has in the beginning, but she uses it to change things, to have a voice, to save the entire Jewish people. And so again, we see this reversal on the one place where we think power is not going to be, power is used. It's also, if we look at the story, a very, very interesting view of power. And I think this is where in 2023, where we can glean so much from the text. We're being shown a kingdom. We're being shown riches and gold and kings and people who are deciding on a whim what should go into law. Doesn't that sound so familiar? And yet, power, as the author of Esther seems to be saying, is ultimately an illusion. Beneath the golden chairs and packed harems and drunken parties and patriarchal edicts are a bunch of sinful, insecure, and weak people. People whose attempts to puff themselves up only make them look sillier. In fact, you'll notice that the people with the most power in the story are the ones who act with the most weakness. As you're reading the entire story of Esther, King Xerxes, who you would assume holds the most power out of anybody in the story, never makes one decision. He never makes one of the decisions in the story. It is always somebody in his ear, somebody convincing him, somebody moving him, somebody accessing power through him. It shows us that major decisions in Persia are made not after a lot of prayer and consideration, but in response to petty personal slights and by the casting of lots. It is an empty and foolish power that we read. And this could terrify us, as sometimes it does when I look to Austin or to Washington. It could terrify us, but yet, we have to read beneath the surface, because when we do, we cannot deny the hand of God at work. The hand of God at work in wounded and broken and definitely flawed characters just like us. I suspect this is why the Jews dress up in costumes and feast and celebrate and laugh in response to the story of Esther, to the story of what was to be the destruction of the Jewish people. Because they are in on the secret. And we, church, are too. We are in on the secret that God is at work in the world. We are in on the secret of the cross, that it is finished. We are in on the secret that God is making all things new. And so there's this beautiful idea of the celebration of Purim, to put on a costume and to celebrate the hiddenness of the power of God. But my hope is that for each and every one of us, we can look in the mirror and be honest that that power is within us, within each and every one of us, to make a difference. It's why I believe so strongly we cannot read the book of Esther in the month of April and not call notice to the fact that it is Sexual Violence Awareness Month. It is something that was never spoken about in the church that I grew up in. I did not think that the church was a place where you talked about things like that, or where you could turn and get help for things like that you would be judged for things like that, just like people have taken the book of Esther and judged her for things like that. That is why it is so important how we read this text and how we tell women's stories. My prayer is that we look at statistics like our Board of Church and Society has provided for us on the table out there. We cannot look at these statistics and turn a blind eye. 63,000 children a year are victims of sexual abuse. 63,000. 2 in 5 Texas women are victims of sexual abuse. 1 in 5 men. Doing the math, that is people in this room. That is people in the places that we work. That is people in our schools. That is people in our families. The church cannot be a place where we hide, where we do not talk about this, and where we do not bring light and hope, that we can be a part of using the power that we have. I was called to be a guest panelist this week for Austin Presbyterian Seminary. When they called me up, I said, "You do know I'm Methodist, right?" And they said, "Yes, but we've heard about some of the work that you're doing, and we really want you to be a panelist on," it was innovation in pastoral leadership. And so I went and I talked about power and how to use power in the church. And all of the seminary's faces were like, "What are you talking about?" Because we're getting ready to be pastors, and they were just sad about it. They were like, "We just know that the church is falling apart, the church is dying, the church lacks all power. We're just barely trying to keep people in the seats. Church doesn't have power." And I said, you're looking at it all the wrong way. In very few places do we, as a society, still gather together around what we believe in. And the church is one of those places. I don't care how many people are in the room. If you got 3 people in the room, but you can all talk about what you believe in that room, that is a coalition of power. And together you can do something. You can do something about what you believe in. And so my prayer is that as our Board of Church and Society continues to educate us on issues of justice, on issues of peace, that we would listen, that we would learn, and that we would be like Queen Esther. That when called upon, we would stand up and use our voice. So much so that we would get to a point that says, if I perish, I perish. But there is the salvation of people. And I've got something to say about it. I've got power to use to make a difference in the world. Let us pray. God, I thank you so much for hard texts. Sometimes, God, they are stories that we want to turn away from, not only within our Holy Scriptures, but within statistics that come across our screens, within news stories, God, within people who we know are suffering in our world. Sometimes we want to turn away because it's just so painful. But God, we recognize that you have called us as your disciples for such a time as this. You have put us in relationships with people, God. You have put us in places of power to speak when we see injustice happening. God, may we not shrink before the powers that will. May we stand up and may we move on the case of love. God, may we move in the world that we tell women and children and victims of abuse that we see you, we hear you, and we are willing to risk our own lives to put an end to violence. God, may the church be a place of peace, a place of hope, and a place of unconditional love for people who have been hurt in the world. God, including the very brothers and sisters and friends around us. God, may you move in our midst and be the strength as we walk in your mission into the world. It is in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit that we pray. Amen.